The stories. The quiet truth inside that coastal hospital wing. The hospital sat 2 blocks from the water, and the wing that faced the inlet stayed quiet through every busy shift. People joked about the sea air, then lowered their voices near that corridor like sound itself preferred to drift away there. On a mild spring morning, Leora Penn showed up with her coffee and a checklist, planning to finish safety checks before lunch. She was 34, and she worked as the environmental services supervisor, which meant she tracked odors, stains, leaks, and things nobody wanted to notice. She liked simple goals, like swapping cracked casters on linen bins before anyone tripped while rushing a patient. The storm last week flooded a basement stairwell, and today she wanted to log the final moisture readings and close the work order. Everything else could wait until the afternoon. Her plans changed before the first break. A nurse from the cardiac floor stopped her by the supply elevator and asked a question that landed with a small cold wait. "Did you move a bed out of 12 East overnight?" the nurse asked, because that room looked freshly mopped and nobody had the call light plugged in. Leora said no, then walked the nurse back to 12 East. The room held a made bed, smooth as a catalog photo, the kind of smooth that usually meant empty or staged. The call light cord curled like a quiet reminder, and the plug lay against clean tile. The monitor cart blinked in standby, which was normal if a discharge happened, which the board said had not. She pulled her phone and checked the overnight service log. The log showed a water alarm cleared at 3:12, plus a linen delivery at 3:28, and the standard generator test at 3:30. Nothing about a bed move. The floor techs had signed off at 4, which tracked with the rotation. She felt the wing hush in her ears as they stepped into the hall. The hush was not spooky, just oddly firm, like the sound of a theater after the speakers cut. She remembered 2 other texts mentioning the same hush months ago, which she had written down as acoustic weirdness from the renovation. The walls from the pre-1980 edition met the newer drywall at shallow angles, which could bend sound enough to make a whisper vanish. The nurse pointed down the corridor toward rooms 14 through 20, which were half full after the storm transfers. "You ever notice the alarms sound softer here?" she said, "even with doors open?" That question turned a small worry into a task. Leora thanked her, then called Rafi Soto from facilities, who was 41 and worked nights on chillers and pressure monitors. Rafi said he could meet her after he ran a test on the pharmacy air handlers. She told him 12 East first, and to bring his handheld sound meter. While she waited, she checked the housekeeping closet and found a single wet mop hung wrong side up, which bothered her more than it should. The rag bucket held 5 clean tags, which meant 1 tag missing. She counted cart liners, then photographed the tag numbers, then texted her team group, which answered with the usual thumbs and jokes. Rafi walked in with his meter and a grin, then lost the grin when he heard the haul. He held up the meter while a monitor alarm chirped in room 16. The reading was lower than upstairs by real points, not just a little. He tried the code blue test switch on the mock panel, and the hallway speaker tone sounded like a phone in another apartment. They stood there for a quiet minute that stretched. She felt the cool push of air on her ankles, like a vent trying too hard. Rafi crouched and checked the gap under door 18, then looked at a ceiling return. "This wing was set for negative pressure during a flu surge," he said, "and someone forgot to return the dampers. That could pull sound into the duct runs." They both knew sound should not disappear completely, and hospital speakers had their own lines, but the observation mattered. Leora asked if maintenance logs showed damper positions. Rafi said the old building used manual marks with paint dashes after a storm, and sometimes those faded. He called his lead, who checked archived notes from winter. The notes reportedly listed a temporary negative pressure setting for isolation overflow and a reminder to reset after discharge. The reminder had no follow-up check line, which could be simple human miss and not a cover for anything worse. Still, the room felt staged wrong. Leora walked back to 12 East, then took photos of the made bed from 3 angles, partly habit, partly evidence. She opened the closet and found a folded patient gown without a size sticker, which was nothing by itself. She checked the Sharps container seal, then stepped into the bathroom and looked at the floor drain for silt patterns. The ring looked clean in a way that suggested a recent rinse, not a final deep clean. She called central coverage, and asked if a float nurse had swapped rooms overnight. The charge nurse checked dispatch logs for bed control and found a 1-minute call at 3:29 that dropped before anyone spoke, which felt like a butt dial or a cold finger hitting end. The caller ID showed the station handset in this wing. Leora went to the security office and asked for hallway footage. The officer on duty, a patient man named Colm Reyes, 37, pulled the clip from 3:15 to 4. They watched the split screens without commentary. At 3:17, a linen cart rolled in from the elevator without a staff badge visible. The cart moved slowly, with one wheel catching, which matched the caster she meant to swap today. At 3:19, the cart paused outside 12 East, then shifted, then kept moving toward the end of the hall. They watched for the badge reader hits that should flank every elevator entry on that floor. The system registered one badge at 3:14 from Raffi earlier, and one at 4 from a night nurse, and none for the cart. Colm explained that carts come up with drivers who badge at the service basement, then sometimes ride with a different staffer when floors swap loads. That could account for the missing badge, and also could not. They checked the service elevator camera and caught the same cart doors sliding open at 3:16. The elevator captured a slice of reflective plastic and the edge of a sleeve, no clear face, and the time overlay blinked because of the generator test. The overlay sync had drifted last week, which Colm was already fixing, which meant timestamps needed cross-checks against other clocks. Leora asked for a still from the moment the cart paused at 12 East. Colm printed a page with the grainy frame that showed the cart handle and a sliver of the room placard. She carried the print back to the wing and held it near the door under the light. The sliver matched the height of the placard, which confirmed little, but the angle of the cart showed the handle turned inward, which delivery staff rarely did when rolling past. She took out her moisture reader and checked the wall behind the bed. The numbers showed dry, which fit the recent mopping. She checked the strip beneath the bed casters and saw a thin gray smear that did not look like dust. She swabbed it with a clean wipe and noted a faint powdery drag on the cloth, not slippery like floor finish. She sent the wipe to Central Supply with a note asking for a basic powder test, which was really a habit from her last job at a larger facility. In that job, she once traced a peculiar residue back to construction dust tracked from a blocked stairwell, which explained an odd cough cluster that week. She had learned that small housekeeping notes sometimes solved problems everyone else framed as strange luck. By late morning, she had a sketch of the corridor on her clipboard with marks for return vents and speaker positions. Raffi walked the ceiling path and found a junction where 2 return lines met above room 15, which could create a pressure sink if one line pulled harder. He said he would check the damper blades for manual marks, then pulled down a tile and sighed at a rusted screw. "This wing is like a ship that forgot how to float," he said, which she appreciated. A nurse from 19, an older man named Keaton Ward, 49, stopped by and mentioned something from Winter. He said he heard a voice on the hall speaker one night that sounded like a whisper on a phone, just one word that might have been wait. He filed the report with his supervisor and chalked it up to a bleed from the intercom test. He offered to show his written statement, which he kept in a folder because he kept everything. His statement matched the time when isolation overflow ended, which lined up with the damper story. Leora worked through lunch and built a timeline with the clearest markers. The service log showed an alarm at 3:12 and a linen event at 3:28. The call log showed a 1-minute station call at 3:29. The camera showed a cart at 3:19 by the hall feed with a possible overlay drift. The badge system had no hit at the elevator at 3:16, likely because of a basement badge only. None of that explained the made bed and the unplugged call light. She checked the oxygen cylinder rack in the utility room and counted 2 empties in the wrong slots. The exchange sheets said 4 full arrived yesterday afternoon, with 2 used overnight in rooms 17 and 20. That math should yield 2 full and instead showed 1, which could be a miscount or something more routine, like a cylinder staged for respiratory and not logged. She asked respiratory, who checked their sheet and said they had pulled 1 extra for a transfer that ended up canceled, and that the cylinder sat by a stairwell for 10 minutes while a therapist helped a patient. The therapist sent a note with the time, which was 3:25, which touched the period where things felt odd. By mid-afternoon, Central Supply texted back a photo of the wipe, with a small note. The powder fluoresced under a standard light test in a way that fit with foot powder or a powdered latex glove residue, not construction dust. That pointed back toward a human routine, not a leak from upstairs. The note did not accuse a person, and it did not need to. She went back to 12 East and sat in a guest chair and listened. She heard the sea through glass and vents, a soft hush without rhythm. She leaned forward and spoke into the empty room, a simple line that felt like testing a bridge. "If anyone adjusted your alarms to keep the peace, I will put them back where they belong." Rafi returned with a small rag of paint, marked with faded red dashes. He had found the damper blades set to a position used during winter isolation, which explained part of the quiet. He reset the blades to neutral, then ran the test tone again. The hallway speaker sounded like a real alarm finally, and two nurses popped their heads out with startled faces, which reassured her and annoyed them. They still had to explain the made bed and the unplugged cord. She checked the discharge board again and found no new names, just a morning transfer to imaging. She pulled archived calls and found another brief call at 3:31 from the same station that ended without audio, which now looked like someone purging a stuck line. Column radioed that he found a maintenance note from Winter that instructed staff to purge stale intercom channels after negative pressure resets, which nobody had repeated since. They called the linen contractor and asked about the overnight driver swap pattern. The contractor said his drivers usually wheel carts onto the elevator and ride to the target floor, but during generator tests, they sometimes stop one floor early and let a staffer guide the cart to avoid stopping between floors. He checked his dispatch sheet and found a driver note that said elevator stopped short during test, staff pushed to 12, all good. He could not give a name, only the time block. By late afternoon, the picture sharpened enough to make sense without drama. A generator test overlapped with a linen delivery and a damper setting that muffled alarms. A staffer moved a delivery cart, paused by 12 East, noticed the mop bucket, pushed the cart aside, and quickly mopped a spill. The staffer made the bed to help, then forgot the call light plug during the rush. The unplugged cord did not match best practice, which would be fixed with a reminder, not a report that accused anyone. The part that still bothered her had to do with the oxygen cylinder timing and the extra pause by the stairwell. She asked Colm to pull stairwell footage if available, which he did, and showed a therapist propping the door while holding a cylinder with one arm and shepherding a patient with the other. The patient looked steady, which matched a canceled transport returning to bed. The moment accounted for the missing cylinder, which returned to the rack at 3:43. She closed her notebook and wrote an incident review in plain language. The review recommended returning dampers to neutral after surge events, verifying hallway speaker levels during generator tests, and making a fast rule about plugging call cords before remaking any bed. She added a line about how lavender air freshener should stay out of patient rooms because it could mask odors that indicate a problem. She always added that line, and sometimes it stuck. Before she left the wing, the nurse from earlier walked up with a small, tired smile. "So, not a haunting," she said. "Just a lot of people doing 3 jobs at once." Leora nodded and answered with the calm confidence of someone who had stared at too many messes that looked like mysteries. "It is pretty much always the simple chain," she said, "and sometimes the chain gets quiet enough that nobody notices the missing link." That evening, after the emails went out, she stood by the loading dock and watched the inlet. The tide came in without hurrying, and the gulls wrote slow lines across the air that nobody would ever read. The wing would sound normal tomorrow, which meant patients would hear every beep that mattered, and staff would hear every page that counted. The quiet truth had not been a ghost, or a cover, or a headline. It had been dampers, timing, human judgment, and a hallway that swallowed sound for a while. She locked the dock door and tucked her clipboard into her bag. She would never tell the story with flair, because the unsung fixes never loved applause. She would remember the hush, though, and the way it taught her to trust the boring explanations first, then test them anyway. In a building stacked with lives and wires, truth rarely shouted. It arrived like a tide in a coastal wing, steady and patient, and loud enough once you fixed the vents. The stories. paramedic returned a ring to this hospital wing. The ring sat in a small evidence pouch with a folded intake label, and the label named this hospital wing. Security logged the delivery in the overnight book with a careful time, and they filmed the handoff at the ambulance bay. Calder Ruiz was 34, and he worked nights on a private ambulance that covered the mixed urban fringe. He drove a high-mileage rig with a sticky rear latch, and he kept a quiet notebook under the dash. He finished paperwork after sunrise when the cafeteria coffee tasted burnt and the elevators finally ran without packed gurneys. His simple plan for this morning made sense, and it fit the tired mood of the shift. He would drop the ring, sign the property line, and clock out before the traffic built. The ring was a plain yellow band with a shallow engraving, and the engraving read LK and May 14. He did not remember any patient who mentioned jewelry, and their overnight calls were ordinary transfers and one shortness of breath. The band came from under the bench cushion during cleanup, and he spotted it when a pen rolled and tapped. He pocketed the pouch because it felt wrong to leave it, and he headed for the East Wing desk. The East Wing used to hold telemetry and a step-down, and now it served as a rehab overflow when beds ran tight. The desk kept a property log from older times, and the same binder continued through years of tape and patchwork pages. The unit clerk looked at the label and frowned, and she called for the charge nurse by habit. The charge nurse checked the overnight admits and shook her head, and she said nothing matched a ring for this wing. She asked which patient lost it, and he told her none of their patients mentioned a ring at all. She said they could place it in central security, and they would open a claim if anyone asked later. He nodded but felt a tug, and the label still named this wing in plain handwriting. He asked if the desk ever handled stray property like that, and the charge nurse said it occasionally happened. A maintenance tech leaned from a ladder and listened, and he said the East Wing had its own ghosts by reputation. He laughed when the nurse shot a look, and he added that he meant the cardboard kind. He explained that old property envelopes sometimes turned up behind cabinets, and housekeeping would move them along. He said linens and small items traveled strange paths when movers closed floors, and people forgot until someone asked later. Calder thanked him, then he asked permission to check the binder for older notations. The clerk slid it over and pointed to a rule that said deliveries needed 2 staff signatures. The binder held thick pages with names and room numbers, and some entries noted patient transfers to other wings. Calder skimmed recent weeks and then months, and nothing showed the initials LK, or any ring notes. He asked if the wing ever logged items that did not belong to current patients, and the clerk said rarely. She remembered a wedding band that fell through a bed frame on a weekend, and it took months to track. She said a therapist found it during a lift motor replacement, and the family cried when they got the call. The clerk shrugged and said the hospital felt like a moving chest of drawers, and odds and ends migrated forever. Calder walked to security with the pouch, and the guard on duty scanned the label with a handheld. The guard said the pouch style looked older, and the zip strip color was not used anymore. The guard printed the receipt and asked for a description, and Calder gave the engraving as clearly as possible. The guard searched a property database and found no ring tickets for the wing, and his search covered 2 years by default. Calder asked if there were archived losses in older years, and the guard said records before 2014 were scanned PDFs. The guard called upstairs and requested access to a shared drive, and the wait felt like a small eternity. Calder stood under the camera bubble and reviewed his shift notes, and the notes listed 4 dispatch times with addresses redacted here. He wrote a short line about a transfer from a rehab floor with a pleasant dog calendar, and he wrote another about a night custodian who kept a radio. None of the lines mentioned a ring, and none of the patients wore jewelry in obvious ways. He opened his phone gallery and checked the bench photo he took for restocking, and the timestamp matched their return to the bay. The ring did not appear in that picture, and the bench looked clean and dull. He wondered if the ring slid loose after the photo when the rig shuddered, and the thought did not settle his nerves. The guard waved him back and offered a chair, and they opened a folder of ripped black and white scans. One report flagged an incident in the East Wing, and the date read May 14 of 2010. The note said a patient property bag failed during a bed change, and a ring listed as L.K. went missing. The report said staff searched the room, and linen hampers were checked in central processing. A second note added that the family could not be reached, and a voicemail box stayed full for weeks. The case closed without resolution, and the scan ended with a faded stamp that looked handmade. Calder felt the small click that happens when separate lines meet, and the label suddenly seemed heavier than its weight. He asked if the room number was legible, and the guard zoomed until the pixels turned into blocks. The number looked like 212 or 217, and the wing layout had changed since then. The guard said maintenance might have an old map, and a shop supervisor kept binders in a cage downstairs. Calder thanked him, and he asked to make a quick copy of the scan for his crew file. The guard printed the page and stamped a copy line, and he urged Calder to keep things simple with the wing. On the loading dock, a housekeeper pushed a rolling cart, and she mentioned hearing about a ring on the radio. She said her aunt worked here years ago as a transporter, and her aunt remembered a family who asked about LK. The aunt thought LK stood for Lena Kovacs, and that name showed up on a donor plaque somewhere. The housekeeper stressed that it was just a memory, and people mixed up stories after long shifts. Calder thanked her and asked which plaque she meant, and she guessed it could be by the therapy gym. He made a note with a star, and he promised nothing beyond a respectful check. Maintenance loaned him a binder with a taped spine, and the old East Wing diagram showed rooms from 190 to 230. A paper tab marked a wall removal year in 2005, and the spaces had been reconfigured since that renovation. The diagram showed linen chutes and mechanical closets, and one chute lined up behind the current rehab gym. Calder compared the faded room to a modern corner, and the old room 212 would be near the therapy office. He felt the workable line appear, and it had more gears than luck. He thanked the supervisor and returned the binder, and he set off toward the gym. The therapy office had a bulletin board with service pins, and a small photo showed a woman in scrubs named Kovacs. A caption said she ran a staff fundraiser in 2011, and the photo looked like a copy of a copy. Calder asked the receptionist if Miss Kovacs still worked there, and the receptionist said she retired years ago. The receptionist checked a directory and found no current contact, and then she opened a drawer with old alumni notes. She found a folded program from a memorial tea, and the newsletter said, "Lena Kovacs lost a husband early." The print used careful language, and it did not mention the ring or the initials. Calder felt a chill that did not belong to superstition, and he asked security if he could call the number on the old scan. The guard said the number probably died years ago, and he recommended the hospital volunteer office for family links. Calder went there and explained the situation, and he kept details minimal and careful. The volunteer coordinator listened and nodded, and then she showed him a book of donor inscriptions. She pointed at a plaque near the rehab gym, and the name said, Kovacs Family Therapy Garden with a small leaf icon. She said the family sometimes visited during late summer, and she could pass a message through a general email. Calder returned to the East Wing desk and asked again to log the ring, and he added the old report number on the form. The charge nurse read his notes and raised an eyebrow, and she asked whether this was a lost patient or a lost object. Calder answered it was certainly an object, and he was trying to avoid making anyone hurt again. She stared at the band through the plastic and then nodded, and she initialed the line for custody. She called linen services and requested a search of older chutes, and she asked maintenance about a recent vibration test nearby. She then told Calder she appreciated the thoroughness, and she would add her number to the receipt. On his lunch break that arrived at almost noon, Calder called his partner from the shift and asked about the bench cushion. His partner said the cushion ripped months ago near the latch, and small things sometimes fell into that hollow void. He said he once lost a pen that rolled out 3 weeks later, and they both laughed about the gremlins. Calder asked if any hospital staff had borrowed their transport stretcher recently, and his partner said rehab used it during a power test yesterday. The partner said the rehab techs pushed the stretcher over a threshold that made the whole thing shudder. Calder pictured the ring jumping free inside the cushion, and the moment drew a simple line through time. He walked to biomedical engineering and asked about the rehab stretcher loan, and the tech on duty pulled an asset report. The report showed a loan to the East Wing therapy office, and the return time matched their arrival last night. The tech said the stretcher had a known rattle in the side rail, and small items could migrate if they slipped. Calder requested permission to inspect the rail, and the tech handed over a hex key with a cautious smile. He removed the end cap and tipped the rail, and a dust mix fell with a soft hiss. Nothing else emerged, and the ring hypothesis remained just that. And yet, it still felt reasonable. Calder tried laundry services next and asked whether a ring could travel from a chute to a truck and back. The supervisor said it happened rarely, and a ring could ride a torn bag to a cart and escape later. The supervisor said older chutes sometimes released surprises when motors kicked, and vibration made lost things walk. She said one time a pager chimed from a folded blanket, and everyone jumped because the model was ancient. She wrote down the ring details and promised to ask her staff, and she asked for the property receipt number. Calder thanked her and climbed the stairs because the elevator seemed suddenly crowded. A retired nurse named Myra arrived for a flu shot, and she recognized the old pouch design at the east desk. She said those pouches vanished after 2012, and she used to seal them with a blue strip. She looked at the initials and stopped, and she softly said Lena kept her maiden name for work. She remembered a shift when a patient requested a chaplain, and afterward a ring went missing from the bag. She said they turned the room upside down and found nothing, and she cried telling the family that week. She asked whether the ring was truly here now, and the charge nurse said it was in security as of this morning. Calder asked whether Myra could share a statement, and she agreed to write a short note with dates as best she could. Her handwriting looked steady for a long history, and she described a bed change and a linen swap. She recalled a code earlier that day in a nearby room, and equipment had moved through the hallway quickly. She said carts piled up while everyone managed the chaos, and the chute doors swung as orderlies cleared hampers. She noted that Lena worked that corridor and often stayed late, and she kept paperwork near the therapy office. Myra ended by saying the family did not push a complaint, and the grief felt huge enough already. Calder added the note to the property file, and he asked security to copy the PDF and the asset report. The guards stapled everything carefully and wrote a short chain of custody line, and then he called his supervisor. The supervisor arrived and listened without interruption, and he nodded at each small connective piece. He said it sounded plausible that the ring traveled by linen or by stretcher rail, and the return timing fit. He asked whether anyone had reached the Kovacs family, and the volunteer office answered that a general email was sent. He decided the ring should be placed with the wing director for now, and then returned when the family responded. Calder walked the ring to the wing director with the charge nurse, and the director unlocked a small safe by the desk. The director read the file twice and looked out at the therapy gym, and he seemed to count years without words. He thanked Calder for not turning this into a story beyond the facts, and he said the path felt honest. He said sometimes the building kept tiny traps from old renovations, and objects slid back into daylight when ready. He placed the ring pouch on a velvet pad, and he wrote the time and his name with a careful hand. He said they would hold the ring in the wing, and they would make sure the right people heard. That afternoon, a volunteer returned with a printed email, and the message contained a phone number that still worked. The director asked Calder to stay as a witness, and they called the number on speaker in a quiet office. A woman answered and identified herself as Mira, and she said she was Lena's niece by marriage. She listened to the summary and asked a few precise questions, and her voice shook on the second. She said her aunt still wore a thin band and a chain, and this sounded like her husband's original ring. She said the family visited the garden plaque every May, and they never stopped asking about a lost ring. They met in a neutral conference room with frosted glass, and the director set the pouch on the table. Mira brought a small photo from 2010, and the ring in the picture looked like the one in the pouch. She asked to hold it for a moment, and then she breathed as if she had been underwater too long. She pointed to a tiny scratch on the inner edge, and it matched a bike fall from their early years together. She explained that the initials were his and hers, and the date marked the wedding by a justice in a quiet office. She thanked the room and said she did not want a ceremony, and she was just grateful for care. Calder signed the witness line and pushed the pen toward the director, and the moment felt weightless and plain. Mira asked whether anyone would mind if she visited the therapy garden, and the director offered to walk her there. She asked if the ring could remain with the wing for a little while, and she wanted to place flowers first. The director said the wing would be honored, and he promised to contact her if any details surfaced later. Calder stood back and watched the distance between grief and closure collapse, and it looked like a hallway finally cleared. He nodded to the charge nurse and pocketed his notebook, and he promised to replace the bench cushions soon. 2 days later, the linen supervisor called Calder and said a tech found a torn seam in the stretcher cover. The tear ran along a hidden edge that opened under vibration, and small things could hide there without notice. The tech also found a coin lodged deep inside, and its date hit the same era noted in the file. The supervisor said this was not proof of the ring path, and it felt like a friendly witness. Calder took a picture of the seam and added it to the binder, and he logged the maintenance request for replacement. The small chain of custody now included the rail and the cover, and the line grew stronger without pretending certainty. The wing director arranged a short gathering by the therapy garden, and a few staff who remembered Lena came by. They set a small card that said, "Returned to the East Wing," and they left space for a family decision. Mira arrived with her 2 cousins and a bouquet, and she asked if she could speak to the gathered staff. She thanked everyone for treating the story with hands open, and she said the ring could stay displayed for 1 week. After that week, she would take it home, and she would bring it back every May as a quiet practice. People nodded because the balance felt right, and the garden bench caught the late light gently. Calder watched from the edge with his coffee, and he remembered the pen that tapped the bench before he saw the ring. He thought about the way buildings hold on to things, and how people read meaning into dust and echo. He thought about dispatch logs that look cold until someone traces them, and then the script becomes a real day. He considered the lines that join strangers into an honest arc, and he respected each break where evidence speaks. The ring did not prove fate, and it did prove persistence, and it showed that care can be methodical. He left the garden before the applause faded, and he headed for the bay to start another shift. On his next overnight run, he noticed the new bench cushion, and it no longer swallowed dropped pens into hiding. He kept his notebook on the dash and wrote a line about the East Wing, and he kept the words simple. He wrote that a ring once traveled the hospital like a seed on wind, and the wind finally stopped here. He wrote that people made that stop happen by checking maps and calling quietly, and by not rushing a story. He wrote that the wing felt different now, and the difference came from patience more than any grand event. He closed the book and turned on the radio, and the night answered with the ordinary sound of work. Weeks later, the director sent a copy of a small framed note, and it now sat by the garden plaque. The note stated that a staff family recovered a long-missing ring, and it had rested here for a time. It stated that the return involved a paramedic, a clerk, a guard, a supervisor, and a retired nurse. It added that the file included a torn stretcher cover and a scan dated May 14 of 2010. It invited no legend and made no claim beyond the chain of quotes and receipts, and it felt right that way. Calder clipped the note into a shift binder and smiled, and then he got called out for a routine transfer. On the way past the East Wing doors, he slowed and looked in, and the desk lamp made the binder glow. The charge nurse raised a hand without words, and the unit seemed calm in the bright noon. He thought again about how evidence moves on small wheels and how the best stories stay quiet when finished. He considered how many families carry unclosed lines and how sometimes a lost object can stitch one shut. He knew this ring did not solve grief, and it gave shape to a memory that had gone thin with years. He swung the rig into the daylight and felt the road through the wheel, and the city rolled forward like usual. Months later, he learned that Mira returned each May with flowers, and she touched the glass with the ring inside. The volunteer office kept the file updated in a narrow drawer, and the drawer label read East Wing Recoveries. Security replaced the camera bubble over the bay and kept the old unit for parts, and they joked about relics. The maintenance supervisor finally tossed the torn cover after documenting it, and he felt oddly proud of the careful record. The hospital moved through another winter without big headlines, and the garden kept the same soft wind under the windows. Calder kept working nights and never chased mention, and the crew understood without any speech at all. He still told new hires one short version during checkout, and he kept the details clear of romance. He said a ring with initials LK turned up under a bench after a stretcher loan, and the label named this wing. He said the date on the old report matched the engraving, and the linen path explained the long delay. He said good records and patient calls made the circle close, and that promise is why they log everything. He said someone cried without making a scene, and that is how truth usually presents itself at work. Then he pointed to the property pouch drawer and the fresh bench cushion, and he told them to check twice. Calder visited the garden once more after a busy night, and he stood alone before the building woke completely. He watched sun slide across the plaque letters until the leaf icon warmed, and the quiet felt unearned and good. He thought of how small choices build bridges that do not announce themselves, and then one step reveals the span. He remembered a retired nurse who wrote a careful line and a housekeeper who shared a family guess. He remembered a guard who kept files neat and a director who knew not to fill silence. He placed his palm on the cool railing and chose no grand meaning, and he simply wished everyone a gentle day. The ring returned to this hospital wing by documented steps, and the steps were ordinary and human and steady. The story did not need a mystery beyond time and movement, and it showed how rooms keep modest promises. He considered that a bench cushion, a torn cover, and a faded scan can hold a family together again. He thought that is enough for any place built to heal, and he walked back to the bay without speaking. He started the rig and checked the lights, and the reflections blinked across the wet asphalt. He breathed, then he rolled toward the morning traffic, and the work met him with the same quiet weight. The abandoned cabin at Lake Minchumina. A quiet airstrip, a frozen lake, and an unclaimed cabin drew 3 people into a chain of disputed facts. Dana Holt was 41, a wildlife biologist from Fairbanks, sent to map willow stands around Lake Minchumina for browse surveys. She carried a handheld GPS unit, a laminated grid map, and a notebook stamped with state records inventory marks. Her assignment reportedly tied to a late winter moose project funded by a regional habitat grant from Anchorage. Dispatch logs later noted her gear list, including a borrowed sat phone with a weak interior signal. The plan put her 2 nights lakeside, with a 3rd day for interviews in the village. Trevor Pike was 58, a bush pilot out of Nenana, flying a well-kept Cessna on skis toward the long white lake. He hauled fuel barrels, food boxes, and the biologist's duffel inside a strapped canvas pod for weight balance. Archived notes from his mechanic mentioned fresh spark plugs, a carb heat check, and a recent cylinder compression test. He told friends he liked the run across low spruce because the flatlight taught careful judgment. Some locals claimed he kept a copy of county file from 2009 in the hangar, though investigators never confirmed that. Mara Kovic was 33, a seasonal ranger based near Denali Park headquarters, riding snow machine for a cabin stewardship check. She logged cabin conditions, counted split firewood, and photographed stoves for safety compliance with a borrowed office camera. Her unit followed a written route that skirted the lake edge and crossed a marked portage used by winter travelers. The cabin at the lake's western reach appeared on her sheet as unused, though records conflict on the maintenance code. She planned to verify the lock, then continue north toward an old trapline shed. The cabin itself sat low in thin spruce, its roof scabbed with scrap metal and patched plywood from earlier seasons. A dock beam lay buried in snow with iron spikes that showed orange despite fresh powder and wind crust. Windows were covered with sheet tin, while one pane held a sagging plastic film stapled into frozen trim. A stovepipe rose, bent and scarred, suggesting a fall or awkward repair that never fully seated. Nearest tracks curved from the lake glare to the trees, then vanished into a wind-stripped swale. Pike landed before noon, set his skis near the hard line of the windrow, and watched crystals skate across the surface. He idled past a pair of snow berms and shut down with the prop horizontal, then stepped onto the snow with a practiced swing. The air sat dry and flat, and the tree line worked like a low fence against the distant hills. He saw the cabin shape through willow and alder stems, and he waved toward a dark doorway he assumed stood open. According to dispatch logs, his final radio call reported safe arrival and stable conditions. Holt skied from the drop point toward willow clusters flagged on her grid, pausing to measure stem height and browse scars. She wrote times that matched the sun's slow wheel across pale cloud, and she made notes on minor moose trails crossing drifts. Snow settled around her knees where the crust failed, and a dry squeak sounded where sleet grains spilled under her poles. Her GPS line wavered along the bank, then cut inland to avoid pressure ridges near the lake's midsection. State records later matched her coordinates to a low bench of black spruce and open willow. Kovic reached the lake's western edge near afternoon, where the wind pressed a clean glaze across the old trail. She idled her machine and lifted goggles, then checked the map case that held laminated sheets with numbered cabin codes. Her photographs showed a dark rectangle among cramped trunks, the near wall patched with mismatched planks and weathered screws. She logged time, temperature estimation, and the presence of one snow-packed step leading to the door seam. Investigators never confirmed whether her GPS waypoint uploaded immediately due to weak signal near the trees. The door stood closed, but a thin line of snow had drifted against the threshold, which suggested no recent exit. Kovic brushed the seam and pressed the handle, then paused when the wood shifted and a smell of old ash slipped out. Inside, light fell through a tear in the plastic, showing a rough table and a stove flecked with rust. A nailkin sat on the floor, half full of screws, and a spool of braided line rested beside a chipped mug. She wrote that nothing looked stolen, though records conflict about the status of a missing tool roll. Pike dragged fuel drums from the sled and stowed them near an alder line, and he marked each top with grease pencil. He strapped one box with canned beans and pilot bread onto a child's toboggan he kept for makeshift hauling. His boot tracks crossed an older trail that drift had softened, and the prints filled slowly as gusts pushed through the scrub. He followed the trail to the cabin edge, then lifted a glove against the window gap to block the glare. According to archived notes, he later mentioned a shape like jackets piled low along the far wall. Holt circled back toward the lake for new bearings, then saw a narrow flag of smoke pull sideways above the tree line. She clipped her notebook shut and worked back along her inbound track, and the smoke thinned as she crossed a hollow. A faint hammer sound carried through the cold, 1 and 2. Then a pause, then one again in careful pace. She told a recorder later that wind tricked distance and the sound came from ahead at the willow fringe. Dispatch logs list a call from her sat phone that broke before a location could transmit. Kovic noted the stove held cooled ash shaped like close-grained fans, which sometimes form after slow overnight burns. She saw 2 bed frames without mattresses and a plastic tub of nails beside a broken lantern with a missing globe. A shoestring tied around a shelf post held a cluster of labels with faded writing and a smeared date in blue. She wrote it as midwinter, though investigators never confirmed the writing due to moisture damage that lifted the ink. Her photos show a floor scuff that turns at the threshold and stops under the hinge shadow. Pike knocked and stepped to the doorway, then waited while his eyes adjusted to the low light and muted colors. The ranger nodded and pointed at the scuffed floor, and he answered with an open palm toward the stove and table. He set the food box on the bench and tugged a corner of the plastic on the window to let air pass. The plastic snapped at one brittle crease, and a thin clatter rolled across the boards until it settled near the foot. Archived notes remark that the sound resembled pellets falling through a funnel, which matched small screws. Holt arrived as clouds thickened, set her poles by the door, and counted 3 sets of prints arranged in a loose chevron. She wrote that one trail ran from the lake to the door, and another crossed from south to west without clear origin. The third ran out toward the mid-lake glare, and its heel marks looked deep where crust had softened. She photographed a partial tread rib that looked commercial rather than custom, and the pattern resembled a hardware chain winter boot. State records later attached her images to a case file with conflicting captions and differing scale bars. The stove mouth held a curl of birch, which burned at the end like a lifted spoon and then fell. A few flakes of ash moved up the pipe seam, and a faint warmth hung 2 feet above the floorboards. Kovic said the cabin smelled like old smoke, not fresh, and she thought someone burned earlier and left. Pike disagreed and pointed to a brown ring on the stove lid where a pot's wet outline dried in an uneven halo. Investigators never confirmed any pot, and the photographs lack a matching circle on the table boards. They found a ledger book under the bench, wrapped in waxed paper that crinkled and tore when lifted free of splinters. The cover showed a stamped supply brand for flour, and inside a rough list of dates traced a column along the margin. County File from 2009 reportedly mentioned a similar cabin ledger used for shared caches among winter travelers. The dates here stepped through early winter into late January, then stopped abruptly without a name or a final note. Records conflict on whether a missing page existed, because the thread holes do not appear consistent. Outside, the lake made a hollow drumming as wind shoved crust into ridges that ticked against the skis and sled. Holt tested the crust and stepped toward the mid-lake track, which bent left and right like a cautious crossing. A shallow oval showed where someone placed a heavy bag and lifted it again, leaving granules pressed into the glaze. She measured the oval's length with her ski pole and wrote the number inside her notebook above a time mark. Dispatch logs later repeat that number with an error, which investigators never resolved after interviews ended. Pike followed the south trail along the tree line where low branches swept the snow and hid thin lines of travel. He saw a thumb-sized shard of clear plastic with a rolled edge, which looked like a lantern piece with frost glaze. He placed it on a stump and marked a small circle around it with the ski tip, then turned toward the cabin again. The light dropped and the sky fell into flat shadow, which pushed contrast down until the trees felt closer. Archived notes suggest the shard later disappeared, and no inventory photo shows its presence. Kovic radioed a quick status to a regional repeater, reporting cabin access, no apparent vandalism, and uncertain recent activity. Wind noise clipped her words, and the signal dragged, then returned in a burst that carried only the timestamp. She closed the stove lid and reset the ledger on the bench, then photographed the plastic tear near the window frame. The cold sharpened, and her machine coughed when she thumbed the primer, which she wrote as normal for that temperature. Investigators never confirmed the exact temperature, as the village reading differed from the lake's surface reading that evening. They agreed to leave the cabin secured and marked the location as potentially occupied within the last day, pending new snow. Holt wanted one more sweep near the mid-lake oval, and Pike offered to walk the edge while Kovic logged coordinates. Footfalls made short squeaks and a low creek where drift hid shallow overflow, and each step left a clean trench. They stopped at a second oval imprint that bore the same pole-measured length as the first near the glare. State records later argued the ovals could be gear rests from an auger or a short fuel can. Dark came quickly, and the trees lost edges, so they moved toward the airstrip where the plane sat, angled into the wind. Pike primed and pulled the prop through slowly, then climbed in and checked a panel glow that looked steady. The engine caught with a short puff and settled into an even sound that smoothed with carb heat after a careful count. Holt strapped into the right seat, and Kovic rode her machine along the edge until the light fell to gray. Archived notes describe no further radio calls from the lake until morning. Overnight, light snow reached the village and the lake, and morning tracks softened into shallow rolls by midday. A second ranger team reached the cabin from the north and found the door secured and the stove cold. They reported no ledger on the bench, and the nails sat in the can without the top layer that Kovic described. Some locals claimed wind pushed small things under gaps, and mice could drag paper toward cracks near the sill. Investigators never confirmed any mouse sign, and the photographs show only smooth dust along the baseboard. Holt filed her browse data in Fairbanks within the week, and the coordinates aligned with earlier moose counts from a prior winter. She included a short addendum about the ovals and the partial tread pattern that matched a commercial winter boot. State records acknowledged her note and attached it to a maintenance ticket for the cabin with a follow-up box. The ticket moved between offices, and records conflict about whether a later inspection occurred before thaw along the lake. A final entry closed the ticket in early spring with a single line about no hazard identified. Pike flew 2 more runs to the interior that month, and his logbook shows fuel consumption within normal range for the airframes. He wrote short comments about surface conditions near Minchumina, including 2 mentions of glare patches that made depth judgment difficult. Archived notes add that he left a spare belt and plug set with a friend at the Nenana hangar. Some locals claimed he removed the county file from 2009 from the shelf, though investigators never confirmed the timing. His last statement about the cabin said only that empty places keep their own time, which is not an opinion recorded as fact. Kovic finished her cabin route and submitted photographs, and her supervisor added captions and a brief summary for the binder. The caption under the plastic tear mentioned a likely weather-related failure of the film from prior patchwork. Dispatch logs show a short call from her to a friend near McGrath about icy trails and a slow return after a storm. She kept the route map with the laminated codes, and a later scan shows a faint pencil check beside the cabin square. Investigators never confirmed who made the check, and the binder copy prints the line with a light streak. Weeks later, village travelers reported two small stakes visible near the mid-lake line after a warm spell cut the crust. The stakes sat where the ovals had rested, and each held braided line tied in a simple hitch around the shaft. A small flag of cloth clung to one stake and tore free when pulled, leaving a short fringe of thread. Some locals claimed the cloth looked like shirt flannel, while others said it was a cut rag from a fuel wipe. Records conflict on color, and no sample appears in the final envelope attached to the case file. By summer, lake water pulled at the dock beam and lifted it slightly, showing spikes that caught sun beside floating moss. The cabin door swelled in the damp, and the plastic patch sagged where heat softened the staples along the frame. A new scratch marked the bench top, straight and pale, with fine dust settled at the far end near the ledger place. No ledger lay there, and the nails in the can showed a different arrangement than winter photographs from the binder. State records closed the seasonal report with a line that stated no further action pending future complaints. Autumn brought clear nights and sharp stars over the interior, and the lake edge hushed with thin ice before snowfall. The cabin sat in the same low posture among thin spruce, its stovepipe tilted and bent in familiar profile. Travelers passed on the portage and saw no light inside, and the door held fast against early wind. The ovals by the mid-lake line had filled and hardened, and the stakes fell flat under glare and frost. Dispatch logs for the region listed minor incidents only, and no entry referenced the cabin after the first snow. What remains are records that do not align, voices that differ on colors and smells, and photographs that miss small things. The cabin holds patched boards and a bent pipe, with a bench scar that means little without a missing book. Some locals claimed the place hosted caches that shifted among hands, but investigators never confirmed any schedule or written rules. There is a stove lid ring that might be a shadow, and footprints that waver between soft crust and uncertain depth. According to state records and archived notes, the cabin stands unclaimed at Lake Minchumina, and the file stays thin. The tunnel collapse outside Talkeetna. Locals in Talkeetna still mention the sound that rolled across the Spruce Flats shortly after dinner on a warm evening. A dull report, followed by a long shiver, came from the service tunnel east of the Parks Highway pullout where tourists park. Some residents said the ground trembled like a freight car slipping its brake, while others described a brief settling hush. Investigators never confirmed a single cause, and the first accounts arrived scattered across radio traffic like drifting snow. The earliest entry in dispatch logs marked a vague disturbance with no location pinned to a milepost. The service tunnel lay under a retired gravel spur that once fed a small quarry along the Susitna River flats near Talkeetna. Built for drainage and utility access in the 1970s, it carried cables and a narrow culvert beneath the raised bed. State records held surveying notes that described fractured silt lenses and frost heave risks beneath the pad, though the quarry closed decades later. During breakup, the culvert took meltwater toward a muskeg swale where moose browsed willow shoots every spring. The structure looked ordinary from the road, which likely explains why few people noticed changes through late summer. On the day of the collapse, a maintenance foreman named Mark Ellison drove north from Wasilla with a coil of fiber line. He was 52, employed by a regional contractor that serviced rural communication runs across the borough. His work order listed a periodic inspection of ground boxes near the decommissioned spur with a note about intermittent signal loss. Archived notes from earlier site checks mentioned minor seepage around a junction pedestal, but no structural objection recorded beyond seasonal frost. Ellison told his dispatcher he expected a quick look and promised to be back before dark reached the river bars. At the same time, a seasonal guide named Lena Ortega left town in a dusty crossover to scout a shortcut for autumn tours. She was 29, employed by an outfit that led small groups to river overlooks and berry patches outside Talkeetna. The proprietor reportedly wanted a safer route that avoided the rutted turnoff where buses stuck during heavy rain last year. Ortega carried a laminated map, a handheld radio, and a habit of text updates that showed time-stamped pings near the highway. The route she intended traced close to the old spur, where alder thickets crowded the edge of the embankment. The third person to figure later was Deputy Caleb Rusk, who logged on for an evening patrol from the borough substation. He was 41, a steady responder who preferred paperwork correct and calls closed without drama when roads iced. Rusk's shift calendar placed him between Talkeetna and Sunshine when the first complaint reached the radio net from a tourist. Some locals claimed they heard the report minutes earlier, which made the timeline messy before the first officer reached the pullout. County File from 2009 described similar confusion during a culvert slump near Willow that produced mismatched clock stamps across channels. According to dispatch logs, Ellison checked in at a utility box at 1943 with routine language and a calm tone. He then called again at 1950, giving a short remark about water inside the pedestal that soaked a bottom bracket. The recording cut with a click that sounded like a glove against a mic, which technicians later marked as incidental noise. Investigators never confirmed whether he entered the tunnel or remained beside the hatch that led to the concrete throat. His truck stayed parked on the gravel with a door ajar, as if he meant to return after a brief inspection. Ortega texted a coworker at 1955 with a photo of berry ground glinting under long sun near the spur. She followed with a second photo of tire ruts that curled toward willows beside the embankment where the tunnel sat unseen. The message after that used a shorter line about a hollow sound underfoot, which could have meant an old box. Some locals claimed she loved writing dramatic notes that overstated ordinary field quirks, yet her manager disputed that habit later. Her radio chirp at 1959 carried wind and water like a whisper when recorded on the station console. Rusk parked at the pullout at 2011 and met two travelers who reported dust rising near the alder screen by the spur. He walked the gravel shoulder and saw Ellison's truck with hazard lights clicking against an empty quiet that felt slightly wrong. The deputy radioed for a welfare check at the site and requested a second unit from Sunshine with standard cautionary wording. He then followed a footpath that split through hops of sedge where the ground thinly crusted above damp peat. His flashlight found the hatch leaning crooked with one hinge bent, while small stones slid into a widening dark gap. Engineers later wrote that the tunnel roof probably sheared along a cold joint that never bonded cleanly during original placement. Freeze-thaw cycles likely pushed against that line until an unusually wet season softened the surrounding silt enough to let it move. State records mentioned runoff totals that exceeded mid-range by several inches during late May and again in early August. Whether vibration from traffic or a subtle settling tick crossed the final threshold remained uncertain after multiple modeling attempts. The concrete segments slumped in stages which matched witness comments about two distinct sounds separated by minutes rather than a single collapse. Search activity began before midnight, with lights cast across low trees and a slow noise like a generator on a far porch. Volunteers from Talkeetna cleared brush while a tow driver secured Ellison's truck away from the lip where the gravel cracked. A rope team placed anchors on the railbed and dropped cameras that showed fractured slabs and water pooling in blind pockets. Some locals claimed a man called up from the dark, which others dismissed as static and wind refracting inside concrete. Investigators never confirmed a voice, and the audio clip on the case server held only hiss and sloshing echoes. By morning, a pump crew from the borough moved water while a geotech plotted safe zones along a chalked line on the pad. Ortega's crossover appeared on a game camera a mile south around dusk, which placed her near but not fixed at the site. Her phone last pinged a roadside tower at 2023 and then went quiet, which technicians called ordinary for that valley. Archived notes from similar corridors described shadow zones that confuse signals when weather and terrain line up against small devices. The absence complicated mapping, yet did not prove movement one way or another before responders closed public access around the spur. Ellison's helmet turned up near the hatch with a scrape across the brim that matched a hinge corner on the broken lid. His tool belt sat on the gravel with a coil of line draped across a stake as if he paused to check the latch. A narrow pry bar lay close by with a clean tip, which suggested the lid gave way without hard effort that night. Whether he stepped onto a floating slab or leaned across the opening stayed unsettled after interviews and simulations by the team. The working theory held that a small section slipped first, which invited a misstep followed by that deeper slide. Rusk wrote a measured report that avoided drama and kept his timestamps aligned with the console extracts on the server. He noted footprints that matched Ellison's boots on the lip and lighter prints that could fit Ortega, though soil made that uncertain. The deputy also logged faint prints from a moose calf that had crossed the pad earlier, which muddied impressions near the broken hatch. County file from 2009 warned about wildlife tracks, confusing scenes when soft fines overlay crushed river gravel near culverts. The manual suggested photographs at low angles, which the deputy used, while the second unit kept tourists away from the shoulder. Crews shored the tunnel by afternoon and advanced along brace spans with boards laid to float weight across pockets. Cameras revealed a backpack snagged on rebar with a company logo that matched Ellison's firm, yet the tag was not attached. A laminated map later washed from a side pocket and bore notes in tidy handwriting that matched Ortega according to workplace forms. Some locals claimed that proved they both went inside, while engineers countered the items could have slid from the surface during slumps. Investigators never confirmed sequence because sediment had moved like heavy smoke behind a fan that could not be rewound. 1 week later, divers explored the downstream culvert mouth at the Muskeg Swale and found a coil of fiber line in brown water. The coil lacked brakes, which suggested Ellison never pulled it through any conduit during his visit to the junction that night. A boot with lodgepole grit turned up near willow roots, which fit his size, yet showed no decisive mark beyond silt scuff. State records cataloged the item without a matching pair, which sometimes happens when suction holds one while the other drifts through. The absence of a second boot and the quiet along the pad kept theories moving without a single solid anchor. Interviews gathered at the roadhouse turned contradictory, where retired quarry hands remembered different drainage fixes done in the 1980s. Some recalled grout injections around the seam, while others remembered only gravel top-ups after a frost buckle that wintered poorly. Archived notes from a subcontractor folder described planned reinforcement that later carried a red stamp that read "postponed by budget." Whether the work happened under a different purchase order remained unclear because several boxes from that period were flooded during a roof leak. The record trail thinned like tracks after a thaw, which made the structural story patchy and dependent on memory that wandered. Ortega's manager shared messages that painted a careful worker who kept to daylight and logged routes on a paper pad. A page from that pad surfaced near the embankment a month later with rain stains and a note about a hollow sound. Some locals claimed the note was showmanship, while others saw a cautious marker used to flag ground that felt suspect. Investigators never confirmed whether her last movements brought her to the hatch or just along the shoulder within sightlines. The company kept her name on the roster through the season, while the tours shifted to a northern loop near Sunshine. Winter closed around the tunnel with plywood bracing and a fence that leaned under snowdrift load as the highway quieted. Engineers sketched a full grout fill for spring, along with a new culvert and a plan to backfill voids with controlled material. State records noted that funding passed a final review with a brief line that mentioned the unusual uncertainty about human involvement. Whether anyone remained inside depended on unproven pre-collapse entries that lacked clear video or eyewitnesses on the gravel pad. Some residents left small flags on willow stems, while others drove by without slowing because the road carried too many questions already. When thaw returned, the crew pumped the tunnel again and advanced with boards across the span to the furthest stable chamber. They recovered a radio that matched Ortega's issued unit with corrosion that hid numbers, yet yielded one short clip of wind. The clip sounded like water coursing through a tight throat while gravel popped against concrete in the slack of a bend. Investigators never confirmed whether that audio preceded or followed the initial slump because digital clocks often drift during cold storage. The unit went into evidence, and the report added another uncertain marker to a file already layered with careful hedging. By summer, the borough signed off on repair, and the fence came down while the spur remained posted against foot traffic. A brass marker sits near the hatch that no longer opens, which says access limited and lists a phone number for permits. The marker stands beside a low alder where berries gather in small clusters that dye fingers purple by late August. Some locals claimed a shape moves under the pad during heavy rain, though the engineer insisted it is water finding the new path. No officer wrote that claim into state records, and the county file holds only measured language about subsurface flow. What remains are names and a trail that winds through routine forms and brief decisions that often precede ordinary work. The forms placed Ellison at a quiet junction with a simple task, while extended daylight made schedules stretch longer than intended. The notes placed Ortega near scenic ground where tourists look for berries while guides keep them from soft edges. Rusk moved between stops along the highway like any deputy in a spread-out borough where minutes stretch and details scatter. The file closes with repairs completed and a line that reads "Outcomes unresolved," which is common language when records conflict and rumors persist. The stories. This abandoned cabin is a warning trap in winter. The old cabin beside the county line looks empty from the road during storms. Yet a warm porch light appears. Drivers aim for it when whiteout wipes the world because a light means shelter, or at least a neighbor. Rhea Calder is 36 and works as a county snow operations supervisor, and she keeps a spiral notebook of storm anomalies. She shows up before dawn, checks blades and salt loads, and marks complaint calls with a thin blue pen. Her goal this morning is simple: get the ridge plowed before the school runs, then swing by a trouble spot. The spot is a bend near an abandoned mining cabin, where people keep calling for help when the sky goes white. The incident that changes her plan starts with two archived calls that ping the same mile marker and both mention the same porch light. The first caller said the light flicked on like someone waved them in, and then their SUV sank past the axle in drifted powder. The second caller said he saw reflective stakes like a private driveway, and he trusted the stakes and followed them in. Rhea drives out with a plow and a county ranger, and the wind pulls spindrift across the hood like milk. She idles beside the bend, then walks the last stretch on a packed lane that should not exist. The lane is narrow, precisely the width of a small plow, and the snow on its edges shows a scalloped bite that her crews do not leave. She studies the porch light, which is wired to a salvaged marine battery, and a hockey puck-sized solar panel. The cabin window is boarded, yet bare footprints cross the porch, and the snow on the mat is tamped smooth with a boot heel. A battery radio inside clicks on and off on weather band, then goes silent like a timer has died. A tow truck appears before Rhea can call the last caller back, and the driver waves from a bright red cab. He introduces himself as Tully Grange, and he says he just happened to be nearby, which is unlikely on a weekday morning before the bus runs. He backs toward the trapped SUV with a practiced arc, then stops when Rhea holds up a hand. "This is county equipment," she says. And he shrugs, then says he can wait in the pullout. She notes the pullout was not there last week, because she passed here in a smaller storm and saw only brush and drift. The fresh gravel under his tires is a tan quartz blend not used by their supplier, which her crews call peach pit gravel because it stains gloves. Complication lands in small details that refuse to match, and details are the only honest witnesses in bad weather. The reflective stakes near the porch are county colors, yet the plastic sleeves are slightly glossy, which means hardware store knockoffs. The stake spacing mirrors a county driveway template, yet the end flare is reversed, which a training manual would not allow. She opens her spiral and writes the count of stakes and the order of colors, then photographs each with her phone. The ranger sets a trail camera on a fence post, angled at the bend, and another on the porch beam, both tagged with the hour and coordinates. Rhea pulls a corner of the mat and finds 2 zip ties and a clipped wire, both wet from this morning, not last week. Investigation moves step by step when the storm pauses and the phones ring less, so she visits a gas station near the turnoff. The clerk says a red tow truck fills up on calm days and buys coffee for anyone who mentions the cabin. A retired school bus driver named Lauren Ibarra stops for a paper, and he says he saw private plow tracks peel off before the storm, then vanish in wind. She requests dispatch logs for the past 3 winters and filters for that mile marker, then highlights clusters that pair with heavy snow. Callers mention the same porch light, the same reflective stakes, and the same quick tow arrival, which dispatch marks as helpful. She watches a dash cam clip from last month where the light clicks on as the hood swings left, then the video ends with a soft crunch. Archived calls from 2021 mention a ham radio voice that says shelter is nearby, and then silence like a squelch cut. A volunteer firefighter says in a witness statement that the cabin used to be a safety cache and now nobody claims ownership. A Forest Service mail thread she prints at the office says the cabin fell off the map after a boundary change in 2019. Rhea returns with 2 crew trucks and a trooper who knows every rancher along that ridge, and they wait for nightfall. A thin moon slides behind blown cloud, and the porch light pops alive at the first gust, soft and steady like a welcome sign. A compact pickup rolls up from the far side with its lights off, then a figure hops out and crouches at the porch corner. The ranger whispers that the figure holds a small remote, and the light changes from dim to bright after a thumb tap. Rhea steps forward and says, "Good evening," and the figure bolts toward the pickup, then slips where the packed lane meets churned gravel. The trooper covers the exit with his lights, and the pickup idles in a pool of steam, and the figure surrenders with hands up. They identify him as a subcontractor to Grange Recovery, and his jacket pockets hold a keychain remote and 2 spare batteries. Zip ties match the ones under the mat, and a roll of reflective tape matches the stakes, which are cut to driveway template lengths. He says he was only maintaining a safety light and keeping the lane open, which is not a service the county requested. Rhea stays methodical because motive hides under habit, not speeches that arrive too fast. She asks where the gravel came from, and he says a supplier in the valley, yet the receipts in his glove box show a hardware warehouse 2 counties south. She asks why the radio trips a loop on weatherband after the door opens, and he says it helps people feel calm. She compiles a timeline that starts with a bridge closure 3 winters ago, which pushed navigation apps toward this county road. Drivers used the cabin light as a wayfinder during whiteouts, while their maps insisted the bend belonged to a safe connector. The subcontractor and a partner groomed a false lane with a small plow, then dragged a lure line past the porch to a drift. Vehicles followed the stakes and the shine, then sank where the wind always filled the cut, and then a tow contract appeared fast. The subcontractor had a scanner tuned for dispatch, and he shadowed snow squalls, then nudged the light when a hood turned. The porch light served as both promise and bait, a warning tone that pretended to help while herding people toward trouble. The twist clicks when Rhea notices something everyone else ignored, because details are stubborn and patient when money moves. The stakes used county colors, yet the white stripe appears cream at dusk, which happens when old tape yellows in cold. The county only switched to that tape after a backorder last spring, yet the stakes showed last winter, which means someone copied and refreshed. She pulls a photo from the first cluster of calls and zooms on a stake that leans at a slant near a spruce. A boot print sits at the base with a split heel pattern, and the subcontractor wears the same make, which the trooper confirms. The peach pit gravel under the pullout matches bags stacked in the pickup bed, stamped with a store brand not used locally. They bring in Tully Grange on a quiet afternoon, and he arrives calm, carrying a thermos with a sticker from a drag racing track. He says he never told anyone to follow that light, and he is right in the narrow way salesmen are right. He made sure the light stayed visible from the highway, and he made sure the false lane looked exactly like a private driveway. Rhea uses her spiral notes and dispatch timestamps and the dashcam clip to assemble a proof that a prosecutor can lift. The proof is plain. The lane grooming aligns with tow arrivals, and the light remote explains the synchronized porch glow. The radio loop satisfies a claim of safety service, yet the loop trips only when a door opens after a driver commits. Witnesses give short statements. A school custodian says he saw stakes in a truck behind the parts store, and a rancher remembers a trailer loaded with gravel. A hardware buyer confirms past orders of reflective sleeves and tape in county patterns, then prints invoices with dates that match storm weeks. The trail camera video shows the subcontractor stepping off distances with a tape measure, then pressing reflectors into drifted banks. The county files charges on false markings and a long list of fraud-related counts, and the state adds a charge tied to interference. Rhea builds a corrective plan with simple steps: remove the stakes, angle the porch light away from the bend, and post clear closure boards. She requests new advance signs that warn of no outlet during storms, and the road team builds a berm past the bend. In spring, she visits the cabin in daylight when the stream runs high and the spruce throws a clean shadow. The boards are still up, and the marine battery sits in a crate with a tag that says evidence in blocky marker. She writes a last page in the spiral: cabin neutralized, tow arrivals normal, and local drivers back to watching the sky instead of a lure. She keeps the dashcam clip on her work desktop as a reminder of how easily stressed people choose the first light they see. She writes a line on a training slide: never chase glow in a whiteout, choose distance markers and windbreaks and patience. She speaks at a town meeting using plain words, then thanks the bus drivers and the ranch hands who notice small things that save bigger things. According to a statement filed later, the subcontractor said he borrowed the idea from a forum where recovery outfits shared winter tips. The forum is archived now, and the thread title mentions hazard magnets, which makes her jaw tighten in a quiet office. She forwards the archive to a state liaison, then shuts her laptop and listens to the heater tick inside the shop. 2 winters later, a driver who once followed the light sends the department a short letter with a photo of the bend in Sunday. The letter says, "Thank you for fixing the trap, and thank you for posting signs that speak like a human, not a brochure." Rhea pins the photo on the bulletin board and draws a small check beside the mile marker on a laminated map. The cabin still stands, where the wind stacks powder against the wall, and a jay hops along the porch rail after a thaw. People talk about that porch like a lucky star in a bad stretch. Yet the real luck was a person with a notebook. A false beacon is a cruel thing in winter, and the fix was not a heroic beatdown, only careful eyes and a stop. She drives past when each first snow begins, then checks the berm and the markers and the culvert past the spruce. The road hums under studded tires, and the bend looks like any other bend in a county full of the same bends. She knows a trap can wear a smile and a soft bulb, and a warning means nothing unless it points away from harm. The old cabin still looks empty if you do not look close, and light can lie when money needs help. Rhea prefers the dull honesty of a reflector that never blinks, and a berm that refuses to pretend it is a road. She closes her spiral at the end of each shift and treats winter like a puzzle that pays back the patient mind. The stories. Why the bridge cameras failed during the final crossing. The countdown to the final crossing had been promoted for weeks, and the city promised a clean archived stream. The bridge cameras blinked to black when the convoy rolled, and people kept asking why the goodbye moment vanished. Kira Mendez was 32, and she worked as a municipal traffic systems technician for a mid-river city. Her plan that night was simple, and it involved checking status lights and saving a complete recording of the closure. The steel truss bridge was due for retrofit at midnight, and the transportation office wanted a neat farewell video. She had coffee in a paper cup, and she had a clipboard that made her look official to crews. The incident started 5 minutes before midnight when the feeds showed minor pixelation on the west pylon camera. A few seconds later, the screen tiles on her software wall went gray, and a red banner said "Signal lost." The last frame showed reflective letters on a banner near the railing and a shuttle bus idling behind a pilot car. The convoy began its slow roll toward the county line, and the control room got very quiet. Kira listened to the archived radio channel, and she heard the bridge supervisor saying to hold speed at 15. A dispatcher replied that news crews were filming from the Riverwalk, and the supervisor said that everyone needed to stay behind the cone. Then the audio captured a short, static burst, and another voice asked if the city still had their picture. The answer was a dry negative, and keyboard taps filled the silence that followed. Witnesses later said the outage was 8 minutes long, and it began as the pilot car reached the crown. A retired custodian named Gideon Pruitt told a reporter that he saw a cabinet in the median flicker. He said it looked like a tiny lightning bug behind the vent slots, and he heard a faint pop like a knuckle crack. His statement landed in an inbox with 3 other messages that said similar things about a brief blue blink. Kira started with the basics, and she pulled logs from the camera management server without touching the lost files. The server thought midnight arrived twice, which never looks good to anyone who has chased timing bugs. She found a warning about an NTP source flap, and the system switched to a GPS puck after losing the building clock. Timing drift can smear security recordings, yet it rarely knocks every feed offline at the exact same minute. She wrote a note that said timing is a clue, not a cause, and she kept digging with patience. The routers showed a spanning tree reconvergence at 4 seconds to midnight, and that got her attention fast. Spanning tree is a safety net that prevents a network from burning itself with a loop, and reconvergence takes time. She called the on-call network tech, a quiet guy named Rowan, and they met at the Riverfront cabinet. They opened the cabinet with a city key, and they found a 4-port portable switch with gaffer tape on it. The little device sat between the city gear and a coil of orange cable that led under the guardrail. That was not standard kit. And the tape had a logo from a production company that Kira did not recognize. She photographed the layout, and she unplugged nothing until she finished a full set of angles for the file. Rowan traced the orange cable to a tent where a drone crew had packed cases, and the crew had already left. A security guard named Pavel Rios remembered a friendly woman in a blue jacket asking for power earlier that evening. Pavel said the team wanted to pull a clean feed for a big screen on the Riverwalk, and he pointed to a scuffed outlet strip. His witness statement sounded careful, and he signed the page with a slow, blocky hand. Kira compared the cabinet photos to her notes, and she noticed a second cable on a different VLAN. Someone had bridged the camera network to an admin line, which would let frames fly in circles until the tree shut ports. The timeline fit the gray tiles, and the 8-minute blackout matched the reconvergence delay for a loop across 2 closets. She still needed a trigger for the exact moment, and she did not like guessing when the city would ask for answers. She pulled dispatch logs for the Riverwalk power requests, and she listened to the whole night at double speed. A call at 11:59 reported a countdown clock failing near the viewing area, and a worker asked for a different outlet. Another call at the same minute said a heater had kicked on inside the west cabinet despite a warm night. That heater was a rack warm-up coil used since 2014 to protect hardware in winter, and it drew more than a camera. Rowan frowned at the heater line item, and he pointed to a value on the UPS history that showed a short overload. The little UPS carried the camera injectors and the microwave backhaul radio, and it did not love sudden guests. If the countdown clock plug shared a breaker with the injectors, the draw would push the UPS near its limit for a moment. Near the limit plus a loop is a bad hand, and the loop always wins, because the network saves itself by dropping links. Kira walked the Riverwalk the next morning, and she talked to 2 vendors who had rolled up cords at dawn. One vendor said a volunteer offered a splitter when the big screen lost power, and he remembered the splitter had city tape. Another vendor said the drone crew asked where the cabinet breaker was because their screen kept blinking, and nobody had the answer. The statements were casual, yet they matched the strange dance of power and packets near midnight. She asked the production company for a contact, and a polite manager called her back after lunch with a careful tone. He said their contractor had used a small switch to monitor the public feed, and they believed it was harmless. He said they never intended to touch city networks beyond a documented monitor port, and they had emails to show that fact. He sounded worried, as if lawyers had taught his throat to stay narrow, and he promised to send photos from setup. The photos arrived in compressed form, and they showed a neat tent with a truss and a folding monitor. A cable labeled monitor led toward the guardrail, and a second cable labeled power ran to the same cabinet. The setup looked tidy under good light, and a laminated badge on a case matched the tape Kira had photographed in the cabinet. She added the images to her folder, and she kept the tone neutral in every note she wrote. She still needed to explain the last pieces, and the final footage angle kept bothering her with its reflection. The last frame from the west camera showed a bright banner near the railing, and the letters looked metallic and sharp. A sign vendor later confirmed that the city changed materials at the last minute, and they used mylar for a brighter look. Mylar near a microwave dish is not a great neighbor, and the backhaul radio sat a few feet behind that railing. Kira climbed the tower stairs with Rowan, and they checked the dish for scuffs or misalignment under gentle wind. The dish was tight, and the cable made a clean loop that would please any inspector who had seen careless work. A scratch along the feed horn matched Gideon's tiny lightning bug description, and Rowan thought a brief arc could have happened. He said a floating ground could arc when a heater kicked in, while a loop forced the switch to rethink its links. They looked at the UPS again, and they saw a time-stamped blip that coincided with the heater line he had noticed earlier. A ground strap near the cabinet door had fresh tool marks, as if someone loosened, then tightened, then loosened again. Pavel remembered a worker with a silver badge checking the strap during the day, and he believed the badge looked temporary. He did not accuse anyone, and he did not embellish, and that made his memory feel steadier with time. A radio hobbyist named Lana Cho sent Kira a short audio clip from her scanner, and it included an interesting fragment. A voice said, "We lost it again, right at 0, and another voice replied, "The mirror banner is killing the dish angle." The clip had the squeal of an open mic, and it included a shout for someone to move the sign immediately. Lana kept the original recording, and she dated it from a receiver with a time reference she maintained carefully. Kira built a timeline that started with setup and ended with the convoy reaching the county line under flashing beacons. The drone crew plugged a small switch to a cabinet monitor port, and they also hit a convenience outlet to power their screen. The countdown team later borrowed that same outlet for a clock, and someone added a splitter that pushed the UPS near the cliff. At the same minute, a heater coil cycled. The loop between camera and admin lines forced Spanning Tree to rewire the network. The microwave backhaul radio tried to hold modulation, while the dish saw mylar flash from a waving banner over the railing. A brief arc at the horn marked the overload moment, and the UPS shrugged as the injectors cycled in self-defense. The network dropped non-essential links until the tree calmed, and the cameras starved for power while the bus rolled by. 8 minutes later, everything recovered, and the last frames returned to a quiet bridge with only taillights in the distance. She tested the theory instead of declaring it solved, and she set up a controlled loop with a spare cabinet. Rowan brought a portable switch and a splitter, and they hooked a dummy clock and a space heater to simulate draw. They hung a sheet of mylar behind a small dish, and they watched link lights as the UPS meter leaned into the red. The picture dropped in a pattern that matched the outage graph, and the recovery time was nearly the same as the archived gap. The city attorney asked for careful wording, and Kara kept her report plain and rooted in the logs and statements. She wrote that the outage was caused by a loop introduced by a third-party device connected to a cabinet switch. She wrote that concurrent power draw caused a protective brownout on the injector bank, and the mylar reflection reduced backhaul margin. She wrote that the combination aligned at the convoy start and the system behaved as designed to protect itself. There were no villains in the file, and there were only decisions that stacked until one more decision leaned on the pile. The production company paid an invoice for a review of future practices, and they issued a short apology that avoided dramatic language. The city barred portable switching devices from cabinets without written permits, and they posted a plain sign that said, "Do not plug in here." The Riverwalk now had a dedicated outlet post with a meter and a breaker that belonged to special events. Kira saved the last recovered frames in a folder marked Final Moments after the fact, and she kept a second copy offline. She did not watch them often, and she did not chase blame in private, and she slept fine despite a long week. The bridge sulked under scaffolding and tarps for months, and the retrofit finished in a crisp morning 2 years later. People cheered during the reopening, and the cameras held their picture while the first car drifted over the new deck. Later, she visited Gideon at the Riverwalk, and he pointed at the sunset like a man who graded light for a living. He said he liked the quiet after a big repair, and he liked how the river never cared about the drama. Kira laughed, and she said the river had better uptime than most networks she had nursed through storms. He nodded once, and he said the city should write that motto on the cabinet door in permanent black paint. The final crossing remained a story without visuals, and it turned into a local trivia question about timing and luck. People asked why the cameras failed at that exact moment, and she would answer with the same simple sentence. The cameras did not fail. The system protected itself when we pushed it into a corner with too many little choices. It was not sabotage, and it was not a conspiracy, and it was not a broken promise carved in steel. That answer never made headlines, and it never satisfied anyone who needed a single dramatic cause to tie a bow. Yet it was true enough for a file labeled complete, and it was sturdy enough to stand in front of questions. She believed that was all a public story needs, and she believed that was enough to close a small and stubborn loop. The river kept moving, the bridge returned to work, and the cabinets hummed in their careful metal boxes by the rail. The stories. This highway turnout kept a missing trucker's toll receipt. The turnout sits between scrub pines and a windblown ditch, and it held a toll receipt longer than anyone realized. The receipt came from a night when a driver stopped for 6 quiet minutes, then disappeared beyond the concrete barriers. Dorian Hale worked highway maintenance for the county, age 37, and he took pride in simple, measurable things. His Thursday assignment was routine line checks, with a side errand to clear debris from an overflow grate near the eastbound turnout. The morning felt ordinary as he idled the orange pickup, sipped gas station coffee, and clipped a laminated checklist to his clipboard. He pulled on gloves, set cones, then walked the shoulder counting reflective posts, and he hummed a tune he could not place. At the turnout, he knelt by the grated culvert, where stray plastic and crushed cans made a soggy stripe against rusted mesh. A folded paper showed only a blue stripe and a timestamp smudged by rain. The paper was stiff, thin, and heat-printed, the kind used at toll plazas that still handed cash change. He eased it open with a screwdriver tip, read a plaza name he recognized, and traced a time almost exactly 2 years back. The fare matched a commercial axle count, and a faint pen mark read Brandt in shaky block letters. Dorian knew the surname because his father still kept a clipped article about a driver named Silas Brandt. The story said a veteran hauler left a warehouse near midnight, then failed to deliver a load of drywall and never returned calls. Investigators canvassed truck stops, pulled camera footage, and searched an exit ramp pond where a guardrail once stood bent. The county replaced that rail within a week, and Dorian helped pour the new anchors under a bitter early spring sky. He remembered the way troopers scanned the water with side-scan gear, and he remembered a family photo taped to a utility pole. The picture showed a smiling man with deep crow feet lines, wearing a ball cap shaped by years of Sunday. He set the receipt on the warm truck hood, and he felt a nervous pull he did not want to ignore. He radioed dispatch for a non-emergency inquiry, explained he found what looked like a toll slip, and requested guidance from the patrol office. The operator took his badge number, logged the time, and said an investigator would call once she could review the old case file. The call came after lunch from an investigator named Fenna Ortiz, who spoke carefully but asked direct questions. She confirmed the surname matched the missing driver, and she asked Dorian to secure the paper in a clean envelope. She told him to keep working as usual because she needed to check archived calls and bridge camera timestamps before driving out. He locked the receipt in a plastic map pouch, finished the great work, then walked the turnout with a slower, sharper eye. The asphalt showed faint striations where heavy rigs often idled, and a single bolt head gleamed bright against dull gravel. A cracked mirror shard lay half buried near the weeds, reflecting a tuft of cloud that moved like something alive. He logged the shard as debris, snapped a photo with a timestamp, and saved it among his maintenance images from earlier weeks. The images, he realized, showed the same corner of concrete week after week, and the corner looked slightly cleaner today. That thought returned him to the culvert, where the receipt had been wedged behind a lip most drivers never noticed. The patrol cruiser pulled up near too, and Investigator Ortiz stepped out carrying a clipboard and a small camera. She was mid-40s, concise, and she asked for the sequence from his arrival to the moment he opened the folded paper. He described the gloves, the screwdriver tip, the awkward angle at the grate, and the exact place where the paper caught. She photographed the culvert, the hood of his truck, and his gloves, then placed the receipt in a fresh evidence sleeve. She asked whether he had heard of any scavengers or roadside sellers who might pick through turnouts in quiet hours. He shook his head and mentioned night fishermen at the quarry road and a retired lineman who walked his dog near dawn. Ortiz had already checked dispatch logs from the night Silas vanished, and those logs showed 2 calls near that turnout. One came from a motorist reporting a stalled box truck on the shoulder, which cleared itself before a trooper arrived. The second came from a bridge camera technician, noting a brief outage around 2:12, which was dismissed as routine. She asked permission to pull Dorian's maintenance photos, the ones covering every week around the 2-year mark. He agreed without hesitation and forwarded the entire folder, even the blurry shots he usually deleted at the office. Ortiz scrolled methodically, then paused on an image taken exactly 3 days after the reported outage at the bridge camera. The photo showed the same culvert, same weed line, and a crumpled label half hidden under wet pine needles. Ortiz zoomed until the pixels blurred, then noted a fragment that looked like the corner of a toll slip. She compared that week to the next, where the culvert looked cleaner, then to the next, where more wind-blown trash filled the grid again. Dorian pointed toward the bright bolt he noticed earlier, which did not appear in his older photos at all. Ortiz crouched and confirmed the bolt was new stainless, fixed through a small angle bracket that sat flush to the curb. She said the bracket was not standard for that guardrail style, and it looked like something installed to anchor a temporary brace. They walked the rail from cone to cone, and she stopped at a spot where the soil sloped into a greasy black ribbon. The smell suggested old brake dust and gear oil, and the vegetation showed a flattened path that looked more deliberate than random. She made a note to have a canine unit sweep the embankment later, and she radioed for a drone with a thermal camera. Across the turnout, a small convenience store faced the service road, and a metal bell chimed when the door opened. The clerk on duty was a woman named Karen Duplessis, age 29, who brewed coffee and stocked shelves during quiet afternoons. She said plenty of trucks idled at that turnout, but she remembered a white day cab sitting without a trailer once. Karen produced a spiral notebook where she kept odd notes to settle change disputes and lottery recollections. On a page dated 2 years back, she wrote, "Night truck, no trailer, short man, hat, hands shaking, paid in cash for cigarettes." She told them the man left a toll receipt on the counter by accident, then grabbed it quickly and stuffed it into his jacket. Ortiz photographed the notebook and asked about timing, and Karen said she wrote the note after midnight while the bell still echoed. She admitted she might be off by 20 minutes. But she remembered the man said something that felt like a warning. He said the word toll like it mattered. Then he asked if anyone was working late at the bridge control shed. The bridge control shed sat above the river, spanned 3 miles east, where cameras watched traffic and signboards scrolled travel times. Ortiz called a former technician named Orville Pacheco, age 62, who kept his own notes in a faded green ledger. He said he logged an unexpected visit that same night. When a man in a reflective vest asked for camera reset access, Orville said the visitor showed a badge sleeve without a badge, which made him cautious, and he refused to grant access. He called the after-hours line to report a vendor mismatch, and the line recorded his message with the time he spoke. The line, according to archived records, Ortiz had already pulled, captured footsteps, a door-open sound, and muffled traffic noise. They returned to the turnout while the drone lifted into a steady grid pattern, and Ortiz asked Dorian for his honest read. He believed the receipt had stayed near that lip for months, then shifted forward during a recent heavy storm last spring. The spidering of dirt on the paper edges matched the way silt moves when culverts push water hard toward daylight. The drone operator flagged a heat anomaly under the slope where the grease ribbon angled into brush and sage. A buried object held temperature longer than the surrounding dirt, and its shape suggested a long chassis with a missing rear section. Dorian stared at the screen while Ortiz arranged a small excavation crew and a wrecker with a winch and safety chains. The bucket peeled turf like old cloth, revealing crumpled metal painted white and a scraped cereal plate near a crushed step. The cab had separated from a frame that showed clean-cut ends, not torn ends, and Dorian felt his stomach tighten hard. The clean ends suggested someone removed the trailer hardware with purpose, then eased the cab down the slope intentionally. Ortiz called the medical examiner and the state commercial unit, then stepped away to speak to a number marked confidential. She returned with a firm face and told Dorian she needed one more favor while crews secured the scene. She asked him to drive to the scrapyard 2 exits west, where way logs sometimes kept more truth than anyone expected. At the yard, a supervisor named Harlan Voss, age 55, carried a tablet loaded with camera stills and cash tickets. He said people brought cut frames to his scale weekly, and he flagged one ticket dated 3 days after the reported outage. The still showed a flatbed hauling a truck frame section without a cab, strapped tight with chains and cheap ratchet binders. The driver wore a reflective vest, a hat pulled low, and gloves that looked new, and his hands seemed unsteady at the counter. Harlan remembered the hands because the driver dropped a toll receipt while counting bills, then apologized like he was late for something else. The camera caught the corner of the paper, and the blue stripe matched the one on Dorian's find. Ortiz requested the original video and the ticket, then compared plate numbers with the state registry and commercial inspections. The plate belonged to a hauler who reported his flatbed stolen for one night, then found it returned with fresh chain marks. He never filed a full report because the trailer came back clean, and he feared insurance delays could wreck his month. Piece by piece, a picture formed that did not look like a ghost or a river taking what it wanted. A driver left a warehouse near midnight, stopped at the turnout, and met someone who needed the cab but not the frame. The someone posed as a camera contractor, killed a low-priority feed, then arranged to hide a cab where eyes rarely linger long. The twist came from a small sticker inside the cab roof, which a trooper peeled away from dust with a gentle thumb. It showed a fleet service company that kept neat records, including oil changes, mileage notes, and a knack for precise dates. Their files showed work performed 2 weeks before the disappearance, and the mechanic wrote a side note about a key copy. The mechanic wrote that a third key was requested by a man who said he was the night dispatcher, and he paid in cash. The mechanic thought nothing of it until Ortiz called. Then he remembered the man never signed the usual authorization line. The shop camera showed the man wearing a vest like a contractor, and the badge sleeve again appeared strangely empty. Ortiz pulled toll plaza footage from the night in question and synchronized it with the scrapyard stills and the bridge notes. The day cab crossed the plaza as expected, and the timestamp matched the receipt tucked in the culvert lip. The truck exited near the turnout, camera glare washed the lane, then resumed with a frame that missed a single clear license view. Witness statements placed a white day cab idling without a trailer, and a clerk recorded restless hands that left a paper corner. A technician refused an access request, and a maintenance line captured footsteps and a door open sound after the call ended. A stolen flatbed left and returned in a narrow window, and a cut frame crossed a scale with a driver who spoke softly. The medical examiner recovered remains from the cab, and dental records from a previous injury matched a profile kept by his dentist. The family received a closed answer shaped like sorrow rather than speculation, because speculation had gnawed at them for years. The drywall load had been simple, the route had been familiar, and the end had hidden in a slope beside a lonely turnout. Motive came faster than Dorian guessed, and it turned on a small insurance clause that rewarded a competing carrier. The person posing as a contractor had worked for that carrier briefly, then left a digital trail of stolen dispatch templates. He understood cameras, toll patterns, and how to bend the timing of people who worked graveyard shifts with tired eyes. Ortiz did not say solved aloud in front of anyone, and she used the gentle phrasing investigators save for families who have waited. She told them the discovery was due to a maintenance worker who kept notes, who walked slowly, and who refused to shrug. She mentioned the receipt that waited in a lip everyone missed, and she promised it would be handled with care. A week later, Dorian returned to the turnout with a new grate and a broom because he wanted the place to look tended. He replaced the odd bracket with the correct plate, tightened the bright bolt, and brushed the concrete until the dust lifted. Cars hissed past, and a train horn carried from somewhere distant, and the ditch water moved with a plain, steady sound. He thought about simple, measurable things as he loaded the cones and folded his checklist, and the tune finally came back. His father used to whistle that tune while changing oil in a gravel driveway under a high summer Sunday. He stood quietly, listened to wind in the pines, and let the ordinary noise of the road remind him why details matter. Karen's notebook went back under the counter, Orville's green ledger returned to a shelf, and the scrapyard ticket stayed scanned. The river cameras got a new maintenance sticker with a fresh signature line, and technicians added a habit of requesting 2 verifications. The county posted a small plaque at the turnout with no names, only a line about patience and careful work. When Dorian passed that spot after later storms, he slowed as a reflex, and he watched small things settle where gravity pointed. He understood that places remember without meaning to, and that a crumpled paper can hold a night in its faded stripe. He started stopping for coffee at the store more often, just to say hello and to count the steady ring of the doorbell. The road kept moving, trucks kept downshifting on the grade, and the turnout regained its ordinary shabbiness in summer heat. Dorian did not tell the whole story to anyone at the diner, and he did not dramatize what the cable hooks revealed. He kept the memory in the quiet pocket of workdays, where tools sat cleaned in their tray and notes lined up square. There was no miracle in any of it, only a patient chain of human attention passed hand to hand without ceremony. The receipt was not miraculous either, it was simply patient, wedged where water and wind forgot to sweep. A missing driver got his name back in a single sentence, and a family traded uncertainty for grief that could finally breathe. Years will pass, and that turnout will keep catching wrappers and leaves, and a worker will kneel to clear them. Someone will hum without knowing why, and maybe remember how a small slip of paper can outweigh a rumor. The place will not speak, yet it will still hold that long night in the print of its concrete, quiet as a held breath. Dorian drove away as shadows crossed the lane markers and the orange hood flashed twice in the side mirror. He felt lighter and heavier at the same time, which is how truth can sit after it finally finds a home. He did not chase the tune anymore, and he did not rush the checklist, because patient work had already taught him what mattered today. He believed there were other receipts under other lips somewhere, and he hoped other hands would take them gently. He kept his camera roll tidy, his gloves clean, and his pencil sharp enough to write down what needed remembering. The turnout stayed ordinary when he left, but the ordinary held a story now, and that felt exactly right.